I'm a firm believer that focus on the things you can control. And that's what the self-funding house concept's about.
A hopeful home buyer here going, listen, I don't know, I can't get financing. How do I afford an average house price, let's say $750,000, if that's the number?
You know what? I'll give you the aha moment.
When we look at what's happening in the housing market, they call it a crisis because, literally, given the immigration, given the shortage, it is a bit of a crisis. We look at how much, to your point, is, a house is now, 10, 12, 15 times, income. And how do we get into the market? Yet understanding that this is the reality of what the market is. So we have to think differently. When we start looking at the problem and saying, well, how do we solve this issue? Then, of course, that's where innovation comes in. That's when a different way of thinking has to be engaged and start to shift. Now, when we kind of, enter this conversation, one of the things that we know is that for the less experienced home buyer or potential home buyer, is they're looking at the market, they're reading the headlines, and some of them are sitting on the sidelines waiting for, a big pullback in prices. And while we can't just speak nationally, we have to look at what's going on regionally in a housing market. What's happening, yes, in provincial Ontario, for example, but literally what's happening in Peterborough, what's happening in London or in Alberta, what's happening in Calgary versus Edmonton even. So those things change, but the foundational knowledge that we need doesn't. So a lot of people are sitting on the sidelines waiting for big price drops, and some are shut down because of interest rates. Now, let's start with a thought process around, we look at what interest rates are today. There's some hope that rates will come down significantly. I don't think that's going to happen in the next, well, certainly in 2024, I don't see it happening in a big way. I think we'll start to see some maybe come down. What's your view of what people need to understand around interest rates, Rod?
Well, it's one thing to pay attention to them, but I also don't think they're the panacea to solve your challenge.
Mhm.
I'm a firm believer that focus on the things you can control. So if you can control your income more than you can control how much a builder costs and spends to build their product and the sell price they offer to you and I. So when it comes to interest rates, I think that number one, I agree with you. I think that maybe we've seen the top, but we've seen the top of the curve, but the
Mhm.
trajectory downwards, I'm not so sure will be as immediate as the rise we
Yeah.
encountered over the past 24 months. So
Yeah.
that being said, number one is I wouldn't wait on a big drop, number one. Number two is I would also, for just general information, I'm just talking concepts here, Patrick. Maybe the novice buyer is thinking, hey, that decline in interest rates is what I need to be able to afford a house. And the laws of dynamics and the history around real estate is the moment interest rates come down and the demand goes up for housing because of that, guess what builders have to do? They're building en masse, there's construction costs, and housing prices go up. And sure, there's a crossover those two curves, but to try and time that, I wouldn't risk, my personal money on it. Simple thought ends like this, Patrick, is that you would be far better off paying today's interest rate, right this very day that you and I are talking, for a shorter period of time. Yeah, it might be a higher rate than maybe a year from now, but I would take that higher interest rate at today's housing prices than the guess for what that same house would cost a year from today. Because I
Mhm.
know that sale price of that house, the impact of its incline has far larger impact on my mortgage payment than that interest rate adjustment. So that's just a word of advice, just in general. But again, I tend to land on foundations, meaning that I like to focus on what I can control. And that's what the self funding house concept's about. You can control your income this way by taking and embracing this concept, as opposed to, can I do something different in my career? Can I, get a side hustle going? Will that work? Will that not work? Well, guess what? A self-funding house with a rental suite in the basement or out back, we know what rental demand is like, regardless of regionally and whatever. There's a huge demand in our country, and so that's the saving grace behind that income generation portion.
So let's start, let's give it a high level picture. I mean, when we look at what it takes to do this, because if we've got, a hopeful home buyer here going, listen, I don't know, I can't get financing. How do I afford an average house price? Let's say $750,000, if that's the number. But maybe it's 500, maybe it's 1.2, depending on where you're at. We have to look at all those things. But ultimately, what we're talking about right now is buying a end user home. So in other words, you're going to buy a home, you're going to have what we refer to as an ADU, or an auxiliary dwelling unit. So that could be a basement suite, it could be a coach home, it could be other doors. So ultimately, you're going to live in the, let's say, main floor or even in the basement suite, and then rent out the other property. So that, at a high level, that is in fact the solution. Now, how would you expand on that in your explanation to give people that understanding?
Yeah, and you know what? I'll give you the aha moment. And this is the aha moment when we sit down and talk to banks about them changing their programs to make this program work, or we talk to collaborators like you, or we talk to home buyers, potential home buyers. The aha moment comes like this. I'll use that number, $750,000 average house price, but we all know it varies. Well, that average home cost, and using the recommendation of only one third of your income going towards, your residence. That's what CMHC, provides as guidance. And let's go with a 20% down. Let's go with today's interest rates. That would require approximately $180,000 household income to afford the mortgage by yourself inside
Wow.
of that $750,000 home. That in
Yeah.
itself is the problem we face. I mean, that's why people are frustrated with affordability. That's the problem. Put in that basement suite. We'll use the basement apartment just for clarity and simplicity of this conversation. You put in that basement suite. Let's just say it's a $1,500 a month rental, probably indicative of a secondary market here in Ontario where I live. That $1,500, if that $1,500 a month income, if it could be applied to your mortgage qualification, or if it's just applied to your household income, just for the sake of this example, all of a sudden $180,000 household income comes into a number probably a little less than $120,000
Mm-hmm.
a year of household income. Now, the savvy person, young guy, young gal, young couple, recognize that getting into the real estate market, do anything you can to get in, because you know that it's only going to better your long-term financial scenario. And they recognize, let's get our equity going. Why don't we live in that basement suite? Why don't we rent out upstairs for almost twice what probably the basement suite would be rented for? Well, $180,000 a year that became $120,000 a year comes down to a number just under 60,000 dollars a year.
Wow.
And yes, I said that right, 60,000 dollars a year. So if I just put a period at the end of that sentence and say that is the one page mindset reset, to understand that 180 can become 60 if you think differently about your house. And I think that, depending on which way you go, you can buy a house and renovate. We're even doing this, Patrick, with new construction. And
Mm-hmm.
there are some scenarios that we're working out where even that rental income can count towards mortgage qualification. So there's a bunch of things that will change moving forward, but the concept remains the same. When you think of your home as a business, a different financial picture reveals itself.
Now, there's a next phase of that, which is, and I love that because that really changes the numbers quite dramatically. So hopefully we've got your attention. And then there's the next phase of that that we have to consider is that how is the bank going to look at that as a first time home buyer, for example? We're into that scenario and we're putting it in front of the bank and we're saying, this is what we want to do. And how does the bank look at that? And they're saying, oh, you're going to rent out a suite. Are they interested in that conversation?
Yeah, and if we were doing this 2 years ago, I'd say absolutely not, Patrick. Next question. But because of the last 2 years of the self-funding house, project we've been putting together, and we've sat down, Derek and I have sat down with the big people at the major banks, and we're having this conversation to the point where we've been working with some of them and actually doing some pilot projects and so forth. So let me now unpack what you've just asked, and that is, yes, they're starting to take notice, because you got to remember the banks are a business too, and their mortgages that they're taking in as a product, let's say, today's ingestion rate of new mortgages is not the same as 3 years ago. So they too are struggling for quote business in that arena. So,
Mhm.
I think that what we're seeing firsthand is, number one is, I want to be very clear here. That example I gave you was not for mortgage qualification. That was for household income to give you an idea of the impact. Banks still have their stress test processes and history and all those kinds of things that we can't talk, because that's every individual has a unique story when it comes to those elements. But what I can tell you, I can tell you examples of where in new construction, because Derek and I being in the apartment development industry as well, we've got relationships in financial institutions, new construction development. So it's a very comfortable space for us to test out and succeed with pilot projects to be able to have a conversation like this with you. And so in that new construction project, one of our pilot projects, we were able to partner with a significant one of our major banks. And that major bank went in and they allow and will allow for this project that rental income to be applied to mortgage qualification. And that's where affordability happens. When that rental income can count towards mortgage qualification, it is a totally different picture for the buyer, because that's like getting a 20,000, 25,000, whatever a year raise. Well, that changes your buying power. That changes your financial position. So I'd end off with this, and that is the financial institutions are starting to recognize there's a change. The housing
Mm-hmm.
market isn't going to come back exactly to what it was a few years ago. And it's going to take creative solutions for the housing business, affordability, and for financial institutions if they want to continue, a very robust business for themselves as well. So we're seeing changes. We're not there yet, but we're definitely seeing changes.